Breakpoint at throw new silent exit exception in Eclipse plus Spring Boot. This follows the same teaching style as your earlier Spring Boot topic. Introduction. When running a Spring Boot application in Eclipse, some developers notice the debugger stopping at a line like this. Throw new silent exit exception. This can be confusing, especially for beginners. At first, it may look like the application has failed. Spring Boot has crashed. There is a serious exception. Something is wrong in your code. But in many cases, this is not actually a real application error. This often happens because of Eclipse exception breakpoints, Spring Boot DevTools restart behavior debugger settings, how Spring Boot restarts the application during development. Understanding why Eclipse stops at silent exit exception is important because many developers waste time debugging something that is actually normal internal framework behavior. This topic helps learners understand what silent exit exception is, why Eclipse stops at it, why Spring Boot throws it, whether it is a real problem, how DevTools restart works, how to stop Eclipse from breaking there. This is a very practical Spring Boot debugging concept. What does breakpoint at throw new silent exit exception mean? It means Eclipse debugger paused execution when Spring Boot threw an internal exception named silent exit exception. In simple terms, debugger sees exception thrown means pauses execution, means shows that line. Example concept. Application starts or restarts, means Spring Boot throws internal exception, means Eclipse stops there, because debugger is configured to break on thrown exceptions. So, the important point is, the debugger stopping does not always mean the application has a real problem. Sometimes it is just pausing on an internal mechanism used by Spring Boot. What is silent exit exception? Silent exit exception is an internal exception used by Spring Boot during certain restart or shutdown flows. In simple terms, silent exit exception equals a framework internal exception used to stop part of the current application execution quietly. It is usually associated with Spring Boot DevTools application restart logic, internal class loader restart handling. Example concept. Spring Boot wants to restart app means throws internal exception to stop current execution path, means new application instance starts. So this exception is often part of normal development time behavior, not a business error. Why this is important? When developers see an exception in the debugger, they often assume their code is broken, startup has failed, configuration is wrong, application cannot run. But if the exception is silent exit exception, the real issue may simply be Eclipse is set to break on all thrown exceptions. Spring Boot DevTools is active. Restart is happening normally. Example concept. Framework internal exception means debugger pauses, means developer thinks app failed, means confusion happens. Understanding this saves time and avoids unnecessary debugging. Why Spring Boot throws silent exit exception? Spring Boot may throw silent exit exception as part of its internal restart mechanism, especially when DevTools is enabled. Spring Boot DevTools supports fast restarts during development. Example concept. You change code means DevTools detects change, means old application context exits, means new context starts. During that process, Spring Boot may intentionally throw this exception to end the old execution path cleanly. So, the exception is often intentional internal, not meant as a user-facing failure. What is Spring Boot DevTools? Spring Boot DevTools is a development tool that helps with faster application restart and better development experience. It provides features like automatic restart when code changes, live reload support, development time configuration improvements. Example concept. Developer changes code means app restarts automatically, means no need to manually restart every time. This is helpful, but it also introduces internal restart behavior that may appear in the debugger. Why Eclipse stops at silent exit exception? The most common reason is Eclipse is configured to break when exceptions are thrown. That means even if the exception is handled internally expected part of framework logic, Eclipse may still pause at that line. Example concept. Exception thrown internally means Eclipse sees thrown exception. Breakpoint means debugger stops immediately. So, the debugger pause is often caused more by Eclipse settings than by an actual application failure. Is it a real error? In many cases, no. If the application continues to start normally or restarts normally, then SilentExitException is usually not a real problem. Example concept. Debugger stops at exception means you continue execution, means application runs fine. That usually means it was just an internal framework exception. However, if the application truly fails after that, then you should inspect the full logs to see whether there is another real error happening before or after it. So the key idea is, SilentExitException itself is often not the real issue. Common situation where this happens. A very common case is this. You run Spring Boot app in Eclipse DevTools, is on the class path. Restart logic activates. Eclipse stops at throw new SilentExitException. Example concept. DevTools restart process means internal exception thrown, means Eclipse breakpoint catches it. This is extremely common during development. Example dependency that can trigger this. If you have DevTools in your project. Dependency. Group ID org Spring Framework.boot. Group ID. Artifact ID Spring Boot DevTools. Optional, true. Then, restart-related behavior may occur. Example concept. DevTools included means restart support enabled, means internal restart exceptions may appear in debugger. So, if you see SilentExitException, DevTools is one of the first things to check. How to know if DevTools is the cause. Check whether Spring Boot DevTools dependency is present. The app is running in development mode. Restart behavior happens after code changes. Application works fine after continuing execution. If yes, then DevTools is very likely involved. Example concept. DevTools present plus debugger stops at internal restart exception equals expected development behavior. Why it is called silent exit. The name gives a useful clue. Silent means the framework wants to stop execution without treating it like a loud application error. In simple terms, silent exit equals intentional stop, not necessarily a real failure. Example concept. Framework needs controlled stop means throws internal exception means does not want it treated like user-level crash. That is why this exception often looks scary but is actually harmless. Best way to handle it. The best way depends on your situation. Usually, the best options are: do not break on this internal exception. Adjust Eclipse exception breakpoint settings. Disable DevTools. Restart if needed. Ignore it if the application works correctly. Example concept. Internal framework exception is not useful for debugging your business code. Means avoid stopping there unnecessarily. Solution 1. Continue execution. If Eclipse stops there, and the app otherwise seems fine, try simply continuing execution. Example concept. Debugger pauses means press resume means app starts normally. If everything works after that, then the exception was likely harmless internal behavior. This is the quickest check. Solution 2. Change Eclipse exception breakpoint settings. In Eclipse, one common cause is that the debugger is set to break on all exceptions, including caught or internal ones. You can check the breakpoints view and inspect exception breakpoints. If Eclipse is breaking on thrown exceptions broadly, it may stop on framework internal exceptions, like SilentExitException. Example concept. Too broad exception breakpoint means debugger pauses on internal framework exceptions. You may need to remove broad Java exception breakpoints, disable breaking on caught exceptions, configure breakpoints more narrowly. This is often the main fix. Solution 3. Do not break on caught exceptions. If Eclipse is set to break on exceptions, even when they are caught, you may hit many framework internals that are not real issues. Example concept. Exception thrown and handled inside framework means debugger still stops, means unnecessary confusion. Turning off breaking on code exceptions often reduces this problem. Solution 4. Disable DevTools Restart. If you do not want restart behavior during debugging, you can disable DevTools Restart. For example, in application.properties, spring.devtools.restart.enabled. Example concept. DevTools still present, but automatic restart behavior disabled. This can reduce or eliminate silent exit exception during debug sessions. This is useful when restart behavior interferes with stepping through code. Solution 5. Remove DevTools temporarily. Another option is to remove or temporarily disable the DevTools dependency while debugging complex startup flows. Example concept. No DevTools means no restart class loader behavior, means fewer internal restart exceptions. This can make debugging simpler. But remember, you lose automatic restart convenience. Example scenario. Suppose you start your Spring Boot app in Eclipse, and debugger stops here. Throw new silent exit exception. You check the logs and see the app restarts and then runs normally. That usually means DevTools triggered restart behavior. Eclipse breakpoint paused on internal exception. Your application code is probably fine. Example concept. Internal restart exception equals actual business or application bug, when it might indicate a real problem. Although silent exit exception is often harmless, you should investigate further if application never starts, restart keeps happening in a loop, another real exception appears in logs, there is a configuration failure, bean creation fails, port binding fails, the app shuts down immediately. Example concept. Silent exit exception may be visible, but another real root cause may exist elsewhere in logs. So always look at the full stack trace and console output, not just the pause debugger line. Important debugging rule. Do not assume the line where debugger stops is always the root cause. Example concept. Debugger pauses at internal framework line means real problem may be earlier or elsewhere in logs. This is very important in Spring Boot debugging. The actual issue may be configuration error, missing bean, invalid property DB connection issue, port already in use, startup exception. So, always inspect the full application logs. Typical pattern. A common pattern looks like this. Spring Boot begins startup. DevTools restart mechanism activates old execution path. Exits. Silent exit exception is thrown internally. Debugger pauses, app continues, or restarts correctly. Example concept. Internal control flow exception used as part of restart lifecycle. This is why it often should not be treated as a bug in your code. Simple, practical fix. If you want the simplest practical answer, check if DevTools is present, resume execution once, inspect full logs, disable broad exception breakpoints in Eclipse, disable DevTools, restart when debugging. That solves the problem in most cases. Example application.properties, setting Spring DevTools restart enabled false. Example concept. Disable restart feature means avoid restart-related internal exception behavior during debugging. This is one of the most common fixes. Example pom.xml for DevTools, dependency, group ID, org spring framework.boot, group ID, artifact ID, Spring Boot DevTools, artifact ID, optional, true, optional. If this dependency is present, it may explain the behavior. Common beginner mistakes. Here are some common mistakes. 1. Assuming silent exit exception is the real bug. It is often just internal restart behavior. 2. Ignoring the full logs. The real startup failure may be elsewhere. 3. Debugging framework internals instead of application code. This wastes time if the exception is harmless. 4. Leaving Eclipse exception breakpoints too broad. This causes debugger to stop on many internal exceptions. 5. Using DevTools during deep debugging without understanding restart behavior. This can create confusion. Best practice. The best practice is use DevTools for fast development, but disable restart when debugging tricky startup issues. Keep Eclipse exception breakpoints focused. Always check full logs before assuming failure. Example concept. Development convenience and debugging clarity should be balanced. This gives a better Spring Boot debugging experience. Advantages of understanding this issue. Advantages include less confusion during debugging, faster identification of real errors, better understanding of DevTools, better use of Eclipse debugger, improved Spring Boot troubleshooting skills. Example concept. Understand internal framework behavior means debug real problems faster. Some challenges include debugger stops at misleading lines. Internal exceptions look like real failures. Logs may contain multiple layers of framework behavior. Beginners may not know what is normal in DevTools. Example concept. Framework internals can look scary until you understand their purpose. Concepts learned in this topic. By learning this topic, you understand what SilentExitException is, why Eclipse stops at it, how Spring Boot DevTools restart works, why it is often not a real error, how exception breakpoints affect debugging, how to disable DevTools restart, how to identify the real root cause from logs. This gives you an important practical Spring Boot debugging skill. Simple definition. Breakpoint at throw new SilentExitException in Eclipse plus Spring Boot. A debugger pause caused by Spring Boot's internal restart shutdown behavior, often triggered by DevTools and Eclipse exception breakpoint settings, and usually not a real application error. Final summary. When Eclipse stops at throw new SilentExitException in a Spring Boot application, it usually means the debugger has paused on an internal exception used by Spring Boot, often related to DevTools restart behavior. In many cases, this is not a real application failure. The best way to handle it is to check whether DevTools is enabled, inspect the full logs, continue execution if the app works normally, adjust Eclipse exception breakpoint settings, disable DevTools, restart during debugging if needed. The key idea is SilentExitException is often an internal framework control flow exception, not a bug in your code. Once you understand this topic, Spring Boot debugging in Eclipse becomes much less confusing.